For this week, we're going to be thinking about how the Episcopal Church engages in missionary activity and how that shapes the life of the church throughout the 19th century. Let's begin with the movement of the Episcopal Church west. The way that the Episcopal Church seeks to reverse its early decline in numbers is by embracing the concept of mission. This missionary activity, of course, is very much linked to the emerging American idea of manifest destiny, that the United States, and let's be honest, the white male members of it, have a destiny, a path set forward for them by God to spread Protestant Christianity across the North American continent. This notion of manifest destiny then fuses with the establishment visions that I think the Episcopal Church still has at the core of its identity. And so its embrace of mission is for the purpose of both spreading Christianity, but also propagating the Episcopal Church as a foundational part of the American project. One of our earliest signposts for the movement of the Episcopal Church towards mission is Philander Chase, who in 1819 is consecrated the missionary bishop for the District of Ohio. In that context, Philander Chase establishes Kenyon College in Ohio, and there later he establishes the Diocese of Illinois. As the West moves, Philander Chase moves with that boundary. In 1820, General Convention creates the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society. The idea is the way in which the Episcopal Church is going to fund mission is by essentially identifying the Episcopal Church as a missionary society. So the 1820 General Convention basically says every single Episcopalian is a member of the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society. And if you look at the Constitution of the Episcopal Church, there is an article which essentially ties these two entities together legally. But let's focus on the purpose of creating this kind of missionary society. It is in order to get all Episcopalians to believe that mission is at the heart of their identity. So I just want to read a little passage from the address to the brethren from a later General Convention in 1859. This is on page 132 of Armentrout and Slocum. I'm reading from the second third of the page. We earnestly maintain that the laity should never rest content until every village or considerable settlement in our whole country shall possess, if not a regularly settled clergyman, at least a nucleus of an Episcopal Church with missionary services whenever possible. The Church in this country is peculiarly a missionary body. Our part in this vast work is threefold, as considered in reference to our immediate vicinity, to our country at large, and to the far-off regions covered with superstition and heathenism. We can read a lot of assumptions into this document, obviously. What I want to highlight is simply the notion that the work of the church is to spread the Christian message, to spread itself, and that there's the building of the church locally, nationally, and globally. In other words, mission appears to be at the heart of Episcopal identity in the middle of the 19th century. A few more details to begin thinking through here is a number of further missionary bishops are appointed. Benjamin Bosworth for Kentucky, Bishop James Odie for Tennessee. Them, along with Philander Chase, are all evangelical in their orientation. So the missionary activity of the Episcopal Church is also coming out of the evangelical wing. These missionary bishops often acted like the commissaries from the colonial era. They focused on building up educational institutions and infrastructure. They received very little financial support from established dioceses. These bishops sometimes were one-person shows. And so this was very difficult work. Part of what helps make this work a little bit easier is the year after Odie is made missionary bishop of Tennessee. In 1835, the category of missionary bishop is created. This is going to make the job of these bishops easier. They're going to be paid out of the domestic and foreign missionary funds. These new missionary bishops are going to be able to create new districts, mission zones, missionary districts, without having to have the requisite number of Episcopalians in the region in order to create it. So before, there was a rule at General Convention that you had to have X number of Episcopalians living in a region for it to become a missionary district. Now, any region can become a missionary district regardless of population. And Jackson Kemper serves as then the first missionary bishop of Missouri and Indiana, operating under this new model. So let's think a little bit more about what mission looks like in a frontier context. If you look at William Champlin Lay, he wrote this text called The Missionary in the Field. This is on page 134 of Armantrout and Slocum. And you can read through this, and what he is doing is setting up an example of how to lead essentially a variation of an evening prayer daily office service in a frontier context where very few people might not actually even be Episcopalian. And he gives all sorts of advice about how to behave and how to act. And there's this great phrase towards the end that talks about the liturgy vindicating itself, and about how to preach a sermon that isn't hellfire and brimstone that people used to receive, but one that rather is encouraging and building up and pointing people towards developing Christian virtue. And there's also this whole sense of hospitality and welcome that permeates these instructions and thoughts about how to do services in a frontier context. And so evangelism does very much seem to be part of what the Episcopal Church is interested in. The Episcopal Church today sort of has this historical amnesia. We act as if evangelism is not something we have done. But for long periods of our time, evangelism was something we were deeply invested in. I want to end this video with just a thought experiment that perhaps we could bring into class in our discussions, and is to look at Lay's advice and to ask yourself, how would his advice translate to other contexts? How it might translate into a context of mission to indigenous peoples or African Americans that we're going to look at later in our videos. How might this advice translate into various contemporary contexts that might exist for us? The Episcopal Church has a history of mission and evangelism. What can that history mean for us today?